Discussion?
Mr. Chair, before you go into your additional public testimony, would you vote in the letter that Mr. Wolbrandt referred to?
On the grading?
Yes, please.
Right.
Thank you.
The author of that letter was
Skip Zemansky.
Gumansky?
Oh, no, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is there a motion to incorporate the letter from Gumansky into the record?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Approved. Motion is carried. Let's see. I believe the applicant has concluded their remarks. And Mr. Gluck, I believe, wanted to speak.
I would prefer to let Mr. Brokenberger, who represented me, speak first.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. I just want to make a couple of comments, essentially addressing some points that were raised by Mr. Wilbrandt and Mr. Jacobs. I'll leave it to you to and to Mr. Weston to address some of the issues on that he's already covered. But I was involved in the early stages. I think it's important that you have a perspective from the Glucks and from myself in terms of what issues were raised. Let me start with the comment that was made. This is all about view, and now for some reason it is shifted to size and placement. That is just simply not true. Let me give you the background, and I think staff will be able to support this, that from day one, with the very first letters we submitted, we raised both size and placement and compatibility, and I'm going to address that as a third point. With reference to how the issues developed, we raised the issues, and when I say we, I should probably differentiate myself from my clients and say Linda and Fred raised the issue of concern about what the project was, how were they going to be impacted on a personal basis with Mr. Lowe and his counsel. It was only after they received a letter basically advising them that if they continued to raise or thought to raise any objections through the process of MBAR and approval process that they would face civil and criminal penalties for trespass and for interfering with the sale. And I say that to you because I wasn't involved. I read that letter. They asked me to contact and present their position, which was they were concerned about what was being proposed. You need to remember, or at least understand, Mr. Lowe was in escrow. He hadn't bought this property. He knew exactly what the concerns were. What is the size? What is the location? And what are the impacts on view? Those were all presented before he ever closed escrow. I did get into discussion with Mr. Jacobs, and in fact, prior to the conceptual hearing, we had discussions about, well, what could they do? And I said, what you can do is take into account my client's concern about the placement and the compatibility. And when I say compatibility, I'm going to say the estate quality views that exist in that area and for those properties. The response to us was, don't put in anything about size or placement. We'll deal with you. We'll talk to you about views. And my response was, well, that's nice, and I appreciate that, but we will put our objection into the record. It'll be in our writing, but I will defer to you. I will not make an oral presentation strong in that regard. It's a conceptual anyway. Let's see what it is that you propose to do to soften the impact of what you're proposing. And at that time, we didn't have any studies. We didn't know what the size was. We didn't see a landscaping plan, which, by the way, this all started in July of last year. The landscaping plan was not presented until right before the last hearing of approval. So with all that being said we would work with you, see what was being proposed. What we ended up with was a proposal that gave no assurances, was personal to them, and in essence, we'll give you a letter saying that as long as we own the property, we won't do anything to impede into this view plane of about 24 feet. Our response was, well, that's not quite what we were expecting, but what we heard from that day forward in front of the MBAR was, it's only about view, you're not concerned about size and placement. I say that to you because we didn't raise that issue. They addressed it to try to see if they could accommodate because of what they planned. With reference to the second point, there's been some mention about 22 feet, 24 feet. Let me see if I can bring some clarity to what that was about. You saw Mr. Jacobs put up on the screen a schematic showing a graduated height going to 24 and then to 22. Prior to the redwood trees being placed along the boundary prior to us learning what limits they were willing to consider in terms of any accommodations on the size and compatibility issues. We saw what they proposed. We said, well, wait a minute. We'll also work with you. I mean, if you're going to be coming to us with something that's going to try to deal with this project you plan in a way that is compatible with your immediate neighbors, not just the neighborhood, we can talk about the 24. I've learned something. I usually appear in court matters. I'm a trial attorney, and there are rules of evidence, and offers of compromise are rarely bantied about. The next thing I hear in the course of proceedings is we've agreed to the 24 feet, we've agreed to this small triangle, and I'm sitting there thinking, let me think about this. What I've agreed to is that we will oppose the size and compatibility issues, but we will entertain some resolutions. So yes, 24 was discussed in a graduated plane that would have sloped down as in the contour of the geography. The next point, the planting of the redwood trees. Those were in direct response to our comment that we would still be asserting our rights within the review process to look at size and scope. Those trees went in, and I just make the following observation. They went in, we asked them to take them out. We said we considered it somewhat close to a spite fence because of the reasons they were put in, an obstruction of view that had been existent by my client's version of what transpired for years since they had bought the property. The MBAR said it's not an appropriate screening element. They don't belong there. They're in the plans that they come before you on, basically that they're to be taken out, but they're not out. There's nothing friendly about the maintenance of the redwood hedge. So as a practical matter, the MBAR was, I would say, did not accept that. There were some discussions about could it be trimmed, how would that appear. We leave it to you to decide, but those should have been out a long time ago, and to hear someone express concerns about it's going to be costly to take them out, they don't belong there under a variety of theories. Let me address the final point, and that has to do with the size and compatibility issue. As I listened to the presentation of some very knowledgeable land use lawyers, and they are, I think Mr. Jacobs makes a great presentation. I think Mr. Weston does as well. I listened to it, and I'm going to say to you as both a resident of Montecito, as an attorney who was listening to the two arguments about compatibility, that I am confused about the assertion by the applicant that they are compatible with their immediate neighbors. They focus you on size. Size and placement are what impact and make someone compatible or not. Estate quality properties, and I don't live in one, but I've seen them and I've looked at them. They take into account a design that enhances views, ocean views, mountain views. So if you look at your most immediate neighbors, that would be the Nigro property and the Gluck property. What you have seen pictorially is that the Nigro residence was designed and developed so as not to impact the ocean view. The Gluck residence, which was built after the Nigro residence, was built in a way that allowed it to share that same ocean view. And now you have the Brown property, which has a tremendous amount of area and that has available space to allow that residence to enjoy those same views compatible with the estate quality, but not taking away the views that exist. My final comment then on compatibility would be this. I hope that we don't lose sight of the fact that the Glucks will lose 75% of their view. They lose all the downstairs, ground floor level, and the westerly half. I've been out there on numerous occasions. I've taken photographs on a clear day. I assure you, on a clear day, you can see forever. You can see to the west, actually it would be the east, and when you look through, and you have some trees in the middle of view, but you can see the ocean and very distant eucalyptus, which do not take away your view. But that view will be gone because of the placement of the house. So, design, size, compatibility. I suggest to you that this project could have been designed and placed in a way that would have accommodated the concerns of the Glucks. I'm going to leave it to Mr. Weston to again assert his position with regards to the 18%. But living in that area, one more example of an 18 to 20% over the guidelines. It's an interesting box that's being opened. I don't know whether it'll be the low box or the Pandora box, but I'll leave it for you. Do you have any questions on those points that I can address? Thank you.
Thank you.
May I speak, sir? Thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate the patience and thoroughness with which you're attending to this matter, and I'll try and be brief in the interest of time. First, let me correct the slight error in what David said. We were not in negotiation with the Lowe's and their representatives. In our personal negotiations in trying to settle this as neighbors, we never met the Lowe's. They only sent their lawyers and their architect to talk to us, so we never met them. They only participated in the discussion very late in the MBAR process. Secondly, we always expected to have unobstructed views, although we realized the possibility that we might lose some of our ground floor views, and had accepted that when we bought the property. But we never expected that we would lose our upper story views. Nevertheless, we'd be very happy if our first floor view were also protected, as Mr. Telcher suggested. We're always concerned about size, and I think Mr. Krokenberger has covered that concern quite adequately. But I must say, when I saw the total size of the project, I was floored. I was really taken aback. I had never focused on the fact that all these outbuildings and basements would be included in the project. We were in the process of negotiations with Mr. Nolte and Mr. Jacobs, and we thought we were moving towards a neighborly resolution of this process when we received the letter. And needless to say, I was very taken aback, surprised, and dismayed at the letter as we received it, and then very surprised that the redwood trees were planted and took our views away. I won't say any more about it because I don't want to get into any kind of a discussion, but I have to tell you, we were completely taken by surprise by that action, which was totally unwarranted, and that's enough. And finally, we need some real assurance that the views will be maintained if we're to come out of this process with any satisfaction at all. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gluck. I think the next speaker would be Chairman Spann.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission. I think it would be more appropriate for me to make my comments after public comment has been closed, although I will be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Are there any questions for Mr. Spann at the moment? Commissioner Tilshire.
Can you share with me or with us the how the MBAR arrived at the 24-foot hedge height? Was there talk about less, or also more talk about more height, or and also was there discussion of whether 24 feet was, with those poles at 24 feet, whether that was going to obstruct that view of the Glucks?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Dilsher, there was a great discussion about this at MBAR. It was our understanding, and when we went to the site to visit, we saw the story poles as well. It was our understanding that this was an ongoing negotiation between the neighbors and the applicant, and it was presented to us as a possible compromise. And our concern was, and it still is how does it get enforced. However, we felt that if it was a compromise that suited everybody at the time when we accepted the 24 feet.
So both parties came to you and suggested the 24 feet. They both both parties had agreed that 24 feet was kind of something?
Yes, and during the MBAR meetings, I would look to both applicant and neighbors and look for a shake of a head, something like that, an acknowledgement that 24 feet was acceptable.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's conclude the questions for Chairman Spann at the moment so that we can go ahead with the public comment period. As I mentioned, I have 15 speaker slips. I have to start with Susan Elledge, but you've already spoken. Are you? Good. I have another one without a signature on it, so I don't know who it is. Linda Gluck, would you like to speak?
I feel a little guilty coming before you, before all these people who have waited, and mine will be brief. And I just wanted to speak to you and very much to speak to my neighbors. I've got wonderful neighbors speaking both for this project, for the Lowe's, and both speaking, for our benefit. And I respect and appreciate that. It's been very contentious, very complex, and all we really believe and want to do is to truly support the process, and we do want to be good neighbors, and we have tried to compromise all the way through. I think that may have been misinterpreted. We've tried to be good to our neighbors. We've trimmed trees. We continue to do that. We would be good neighbors for the Lowe's. This has just been very unfortunate, and thank you for your time and concern.
Thank you, Ms. Gluck. Let's see. Secretary, would you make sure that the light is on for the speakers? Next speaker is Bob Villas, I think, followed by Pamela Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, board members. I'll make my comments very brief. I'm a former neighbor of the Lowe's. I live in the Riven Rock area. I live at 757 Riven Rock Road, and my home was located one house removed from the Lowe's. They lived at 771 Garden Lane. So we were effectively neighbors, but separated by a house. And I just wanted to tell you from my experience that the Lowe's really improved the property values in Riven Rock because of the quality of their home, the way it was built, located, landscaped, hardscaped. The whole area around their home, those other properties became more valuable. They just did a terrific job. They are very environmentally, we were stunned. They're very environmentally concerned. They built a home using green techniques. Their treatment of the Riven Rock Creek, which could have been over the top, was so understated and beautifully done. I would describe what they typically do as being understated. And lastly, I would tell you that they were terrific neighbors to us because we did a construction project in their backyard effectively. For about a year and a half, we had trucks and workers and heavy equipment, noise, dust, and they couldn't have been nicer to us. They were terrific neighbors to work with. They put up with a lot, and I just wanted to commend them to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Pamela Taylor, to be followed by Mr. Lowe.
Thank you very much. I'm sitting in the background listening to all these neighbors and thinking that, gosh, the Glucks are terrific people. I'm sure that listening to other people that I have also decided that the Lowe's are very nice people as well. And I really, really think that it's going to be very difficult for you to make a decision. However, I think that these two families can get together without attorneys and probably come to a very good agreement. I know that your position is extremely difficult, but it is also a fact of life that I have been to the Glucks many, 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 many times, and they actually do have and have always had a very, very good view. And it would be a shame to take that away, and it would also be a shame if they can't get together.
Thank you. Mr. Lowe, do you wish to speak again? Norman Haberman, to be followed by Skip Harkson.
I, too, will be brief. I'm Norm Haberman. I've been a resident of Montecito for over 25 years. I, in fact, lived not far from the area in question for most of those years. And my comments are more appropriately to this committee and to the process rather than to the individual aspects, because I can understand both sides of this. My concern is that this group and the governing bodies who also opine on subjects such as this need to be concerned about what our community was and where it is now. And I'm not against development. I'm sort of for development. But it's got to be done orderly and neighborly as well. And my concern really is one when you deal with guidelines that you worked so hard to establish that have been in place for a long time, that I've watched over all these years, where the exception becomes the rule. And each precedent starts a new boundary for the parameters of the next project. And my concern somehow is that you will take into account not only the neighborly compatibility of this particular issue, but also the fact that we want this community to have some of the charm and some of the allure that brought us all here many, many years ago. And I would only hope that you will weigh both sides compassionately with the idea of coming up with some sort of a compromise that meets, if not all, the needs of both parties, but certainly addresses their needs, and you come up with an answer that at least has some compromise in it for all parties involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Haberman. Mr. Harkson, to be followed by Mr. Wolbrandt.
Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, I'm Skip Harkson, and I'm here today just to explain a couple things. I represented Fred and Linda Gluck in the purchase of the home that we're discussing. And I can tell you, and I can go back very vividly in my mind, at the time it was purchased, the views were magnificent. And I mean unobstructed from the ground floor and, of course, the second floor. And I can remember at the time, both of them were so taken by the property because of the views. Mr. Nigro done a beautiful job in terms of building the home and designing it. But those massive views meant a lot. At the time, I recall there was a hedge, and it wasn't very tall at all. And I remember talking to Fred and Linda, and they expressed concern at the time that, you know, what happens down the road? And of course, there are no certainties. But one of the things that I've learned in all the years that I've sold real estate in Montecito is that we have the good neighbor policy. And I really hadn't heard of problems that would arise where neighbors couldn't work things out. It seems times have changed. And I think it's very sad, the situation that two great sides, the Lows and the Glucks, are where they are. But I did think it was important for you to know that back during that time, there was a wonderful view and every expectation that it would continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wilbrandt, did you wish to speak again? Okay. Mr. Negro, to be followed by Filippini.
Jim Nigro, I'm the neighbor to the east, and just to clarify a couple of points, you know, obviously I know the history of the property since I did own both properties, and there absolutely was a clear ocean view at the time that the Glucks purchased it, and I can't imagine Fred Gluck ever cutting trees or telling anyone to go cut trees. And that I did meet with Rob Lowe and Chris Jacobs a couple of months ago because they knew I had a concern of drainage. And the MBAR also acknowledged that there was an issue. And they revised their plans, and I met with Rob and Chris Jacobs, and they assured me they were going to get me a set of plans so I could thoroughly review it because I am in the business. I have not seen the plans yet, but I'm sure ultimately they will be done correctly. But I also advised them at the time that knowing Fred and Linda for years and building their house, that they were extremely reasonable people and that I would hope they could come to some compromise regarding this issue. We would love to have them for neighbors and see the property developed, because we were, happy when the Browns bought it, and we thought the Browns were going to build on it, and that fell apart. So we would like to see it happen. And as not to be repetitive, but I think it is important to be a good neighbor. I mean, Dr. Somberg built behind me. I never met the gentleman, but when he was building, he had an issue. There was a couple of trees on my property. He sent his landscaper over, asked if he could trim my trees. I said, absolutely. I didn't have to think twice. That's what I moved to Montecito for. I mean, to have the great ocean views, the mountain views, and that's what we're here for. And I think it would be a shame for the Glucks to lose that. And I certainly hope they could work it out. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Filippini?
My name is Richard Filippini. I live at 680 Picacho, and I lived at this property for approximately 18 years. I'm very familiar with the property up above me, and I too concur with Jim Nigro that the views from the Glucks property was unobstructed, and that John Peters didn't plant any trees on that property. He just did grading. I'm also concerned about what I've heard at this hearing, that the grade has subsequently changed by approximately 2.5 feet. And that makes the story poles disingenuous that were placed there before. I objected at that time to the MBR, to the size, height of the building, to the size of the building, the number of buildings, the location on the property, and my property. I have a conflict of really complaining about this, because what you're telling me to do, if you do not follow the guidelines, it tells me that I should tear down my house, which is roughly about 6,900 square feet, and build about 16,000 square feet there. I quite frankly don't want to do that, but we're piecemealed on this process. If the grading has changed, I think that what, as a normal process to do, is to reinstate the story poles, because my mountain views are going to be blacked out from my property, a big portion of my mountain views. So nobody addresses the property, which is I'm probably more impacted than even the Glucks because of the proximity of my property to theirs. I border on Picacho Lane Jr., and I would love to have you reconsider exactly what's going on right now, because that is probably what I will do if I will be given the same consideration that the Lowe's are being given. I will probably tear down the house and put up maybe a 16,000 square foot house if I get the same treatment. Thank you very much.
Sir?
Just a moment. Commissioner?
Do I understand that it's your belief that the grading was altered since the MBAR's decision?
I believe I heard that a few minutes ago, that it was raised by 2.5 feet.
Okay. Well,
No, I actually, let me clarify that. I had asked the question whether the house is proposed, whether the grade underneath the house was going to be raised. I do not think it's been raised yet, but there is a proposal to, it looks like 2.5 at one end and maybe 3 to 4 according to the architect at the other end. Now, with regards to the story poles, one would have to ask whether the tops of the story poles actually included that change of grade. That would be the question that I would ask if I wanted to know what the neighbors had seen.
Right.
Because that can't, obviously the story poles can be at any height and they can take into account that change of grade. And I don't know what happened because I didn't see the story poles. Okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
What I think also what occurs is that when a basement is put in, where does the grade start? Because they have a tendency of doing it, what they do is they'll backfill up to the height of the basement wall, and they'll consider that the grade. So I don't know what's occurring here now. I just heard that the grade was going to be pushed up 2.5 feet. So I think that we need clarification there, and maybe we need the story poles replaced. I also objected very strongly to the size of the cupola, which was very intrusive. Thank you.
Thank you. I have speaker slips here from Mr. Weston and Mr. Jacobs, but I presume they've already spoken to their fill. Not true? Just a minute.
Yes, I was hoping that when we were all done, there would be an opportunity for recomments, very short.
Yes. Well, that concludes the public comment period. Is there any other comment? All right, the public comment period is closed.
Mr. Chair, might I suggest, the normal course of your hearing would be that the applicant speaks and then the appellant has the last word, but you wanted to hear from Mr. Spahn as well, and they might want to respond to comments that he makes.
Yeah. I was waiting to see what Chairman Spahn wanted to do.
I'm ready, Mr. Chair, if you are. Diane, can I have you hand this to Aaron? I'm just going to go through my notes, Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, in no particular order. I think just as the way they kind of came up. There was discussion about neighborhood compatibility. The first document that I had Aaron put up is the neighborhood study done by you, Chair McGrebley, back in, I guess, 93, 94, 95. This is where we start at MBAR for all projects, especially those projects that exceed the guidelines. Unfortunately, this project is not part of the public documents, not part of the architectural guidelines, and it's not made public to any of the applicants. So it's become a tool that hasn't really helped us tremendously. Hopefully, as we go on and revisit these guidelines, maybe a tool like this can be incorporated as well. So what we do on most projects, go to number 2, Aaron. What we do on most projects, that almost all projects that require FAR studies, which are projects that exceed the guidelines, is we ask for an FAR study, we ask for story polls, and we visit the site. And at that time, we have a long discussion about whether or not the FAR study really represents the neighborhood. And in this particular case, the MBAR decided that the MBAR study map that was presented to us did actually reflect the current neighborhood, mainly because it was, if you see the sites in the center, it's shown in blue. But it was built up all around. It seemed to be the last parcel, and it seemed to us that the proposal that was coming forward was similar in size, scope, and scale to what the neighbors already did. A couple of caveats, though. An Aaron Briggs study, neighborhood study, and the staff report, and I believe Derek Weston's also, his study, I think, matches or marries to Aaron's. For some reason, two parcels that MBAR considered that aren't on those two are the ones shown in yellow. And we're not sure why, but what we also look for are parcels that are of similar size. And these parcels, there are 4 of them, they're a similar size. You'll see that the top one, I believe, is over the recommended guidelines by 50-something%. 59%, thank you, Claire. The one to the upper right is 17% over. The one immediately next to the low property is 18% over, and the one further down is 15% over. But they're also, what's important about that for the MBAR is they're the same size parcel. Now, I know that this is a mathematical thing. It doesn't take into consideration topography, terrain, creeks, but unfortunately the way that the guidelines are written, it's a mathematical premise that you've got to look at. So this is one tool we look at. The other tool we look at is neighborhood compatibility. We're done with the overheads, thanks, Aaron. And neighborhood compatibility to us is size, topography, location, visibility, aesthetics, the use, the landscape. And in this particular case, we feel, as you know, by our ultimate vote and preliminary approval, that this project is compatible with the neighborhood. We do not take into consideration total development. That is not something that we do. It's not something that's in the guidelines. I know it's being discussed at this point. But this idea of changing the rules midstream is extremely concerning to the MBAR. It's not something that we want to take lightly. We don't think it's fair. We don't think it's reasonable to the applicants or to the community. We think a dialogue needs to occur. That dialogue is starting to occur with subcommittees. We believe that those subcommittees need to do their work. They need to get into the meats and bones, and maybe as part of that total development and neighborhoods, this will all come out of it. But to try to impose those kind of conditions on this kind of project right now, we think is very dangerous. We don't think it's correct to do. The landscape plan, we were put into I think the MBAR was put into a quandary and stuck in the middle in a very difficult situation. We typically don't look and want to be the enforcement body of a landscape plan. It falls upon the county, but we were in this case put in the middle of that. And I think what we tried to do was hear both sides of the story and try to make a compromise. It was presented to us from day one from the Glucks that a view easement was what they ultimately were after, and we struggled with that. We knew that it is not our authority to give a view easement, and we understood that there was a concern here. And as the chair of the MBAR, I made sure every time that things were discussed and compromises were discussed, I looked at both the applicant and all the neighbors in the room at the time and looked for either a nod or an acknowledgement that that was okay, that we're going in the right direction. We also knew that because we told them to do this, as they left the room, we expected negotiations to occur with the neighbors out of our purview, because it really isn't our purview to do those kind of things. I just real quickly, the story polls did take into account the grade change. It was a concern of ours. We discussed the cupola. We discussed many aspects of this project ad nauseum for a great deal of time. It was 5 or 6 meetings. I believe that the project that you have before you is a good project, and we would hope that you would deny this appeal and let the project move forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I have a question for you, Chairman. You showed us the area which you regarded as as the neighborhood. There were no parcels to the west of Picacho. What was your thinking there?
Mr. Chair, there was a long discussion about this. Many members of the MBAR felt that, including parcels to the west of the subject parcel, would be parcels that are much larger and would simply allow or show a much larger FAR overage, as it were. So they thought that would not be a thing to do for anyone at this point. If they thought that if we thought that there were parcels that were more 3 acres size of the subject parcel, we would prefer to have that neighborhood extended, the FAR study extended. But really what it came down to is the MBAR saw this as, like I said, an infill. All the parcels around it were developed. It seemed to be the last parcel, and it seemed to be coming to us similarly developed as the neighboring parcels.
Yes, and you also made a comment about the total development on a parcel. You're entirely correct that it is not part of our guidelines or standards at this time, and they should not be included in our deliberations. Commissioner Phillips?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chairman Span, can you tell me can you explain rather your understanding as to the perimeter height limitation, how it would work?
I think it's real simple. And it's real simple in that there is a condition of land use permit this land use permit that will identify and recognize the approved landscape plan. And at any one time, a neighbor, a member of the public can go to the county and say, look, here's the approved landscape plan. The Lowe's are not in compliance with it. We want enforcement of it.
So they're standing beyond the Glucks to object to a perceived violation. And this limitation would run with the land. It would continue. And this is something you've never done before? Was that your testimony?
Not on projects like this. These kind of conditions will show up on projects that the MPC might see. Mm-hmm. Conditions of approval for development plans, larger projects, but typically not at the MBAR level.
Who would pay for the trimming, do you think?
I would expect that if it's in compliance with an approved plan, that whoever owns that plan or that parcel would pay for that.
Would be the owner of the property. And I think it's your testimony that was a sense of agreement at 24 feet. If it had been 18 feet, that would have been fine with you as well? Okay. Do you feel that in the future you're going to have to look at these issues, perimeter height limitations, because you've done it once? Is this something that you're going to have to do in the future?
Probably not because we've done it once, but probably because of the constraints and the amount of development occurring in the community, yes, for that reason.
As we get closer to each other, this
is going to become a concern.
Yeah.
And yes, we are concerned about setting precedent. And the major concern we have at the MBAR is not just to the landscape, but we feel the design guidelines need to be revisited. They need to be strengthened. We need better tools.
I certainly would like all neighbors to have more guidance as to expectations, certainly. I don't know exactly how to do it at this moment. Did you fashion the type of plant? And if it's in here, I'm sorry, I missed it.
Yes, we did. There were two concerns, and Sam Mathis is our MBA, our landscape architect member. He worked closely with Grant Castleberg. The hedge and as well as the trees, there was a concept that that if you allow that if there is this perceived 24-foot height limit, or however you want to describe it over the is that northeasterly portion of the parcel, that instead of allowing trees, redwoods that would grow larger, taller than that, and have them topped off, why not simply spec a tree, or specify a tree and plant a tree that doesn't grow any higher than 24, 25 feet? And that's what we went with.
So perhaps we won't have to trim it all.
That would be the concept.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Does that, Chairman, does that imply, though, that if the redwoods grow taller, that they would have to be cut then?
Yes, and that is why the MBAR, Mr. Chair, did not like the redwoods to be used in this particular
But
case.
that also implies that perhaps they should be removed.
That's exactly what our plan, what the proposed plan asked for them to be removed, or relocated on the site some other location.
Commissioner Berg.
Chairman McRevlin. Mr. Span, the issue of the height of the finished floor, was that addressed? And could you explain to us what considerations you took there?
Yes, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Berg. The height of the finished floor is always taken into consideration when story poles are put up. And in this particular case, if I'm not mistaken, and I've got to look back at my notes, when we were at the site, we actually asked that the entire project be lowered 4 feet, and I believe that the approved project is a reduction of the ridge line. And it was done in a couple of different ways. But yes, the finished floor, if you look at the architect's drawings, all it really is a requirement to direct water away from the property, from the building itself. It's not very large. It's a foot in one case. I think it goes down to 3 or 4 feet in the other. That's all it is. It's not high out of the ground.
Right. I think we've been misreading the plans then, because our assumption, the scale on these is difficult for us to see. But our assumption was that they were actually, it was being padded up by between 2 and 4 feet, and that's not correct.
That's not the case.
That's not correct.
But the grade, excuse me, Commissioner, but the grade that has been proposed here is below what had been originally contemplated? Did I understand you?
No. No, the height of the structure, as approved.
Well, just the height of the structure, but not the grade.
About 4 feet.
If I could continue. Mr. Span, Mr. Filippini brought up the issue of the cupola and the effect on his property. Did you have a chance to consider that in your deliberations?
Actually, we did. We talked about this at great length. One of the things you'll notice about this house is that it's in the American colonial style. It's not something that we see a lot in Montecito. And it's something that at the MBAR we find refreshing. We heard Mr. Filippini, we went down to his property, we looked back up at the site, we saw the story poles. We do not feel that the cupola will even be seen from Mr. Filippini's property, and that is the way that MBAR looked at that project.
And you all agreed that that was the case. Thank you.
Commissioner Gotstenker.
Chairman Span, or maybe actually this needs to go to the architect. I am unable to determine from either the big landscape plan or the site plan that we have in front of us that Mr. Berg is getting the magnifying glass out to look at, where the redwoods are that we're talking about. I don't find these redwoods located on the plans. No.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Gotstenker, I think Aaron's trying to point it out on the site plan.
But there are also a bunch of them along that eastern boundary.
And Mr. Chair, Commissioner Gotstenker, the trees were required to be removed as part of the approved plans. What you see there are the approved plans that show them removed, and there's a notation, redwood trees to be removed, so they don't show up.
I see that. So, I mean, that's why I went up there and looked to see if I could find that. You know, so what we're saying is that the redwood there's literally a grove of redwood trees right there that is in question, because that is. Now, are there redwood trees located in other places on the property that are proposed to stay? Okay, because we did see those story poles. That's not where those story poles were located in the photographs that were to indicate the redwood trees. That's not, they weren't there. They were somewhere else. Where are those?
Same corner. The redwoods could be removed from here.
Right there, I understand. I see that. Oh, where did you get this from?
I just got it from him.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, I didn't see this. So those are to be removed. Then this, okay, so there's one right there. Okay, so then there are scattered redwood trees existing above the house to the, above the guest parking, in other words.
To the west.
It looks like on this plan that we've got some others right in there.
There's more here, there's more here, and I believe there's one in this area somewhere in here to be removed.
Those are the Aleppo pines.
There were 3 to be removed.
Oh, existing redwood to be removed, I see. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. It's way easier to see this on this plan.
Yeah, I have a comment on that, too. My understanding is that, and I've been on the site, there are some redwood trees right in here as part of a hedge.
No.
I don't think so.
No.
I remember seeing them.
I don't remember seeing them. That's why I'm
You
trying
may
to
be referring to
clarify
those
which ones we're
pine
talking
trees. There's
about.
2 pine trees? Is that what you're
There's a
thinking of?
pine tree, but there's a couple of redwoods right in here.
It says right here, remove existing redwoods, and it points to right here.
All right, then those must be the ones that I'm referring to. Okay. All right, let's see. Commissioner Tilsher, next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to just go back for a minute to when you were talking about the 24-foot height of the hedge. And I know you said that he looked around and Mr. Gluck nodded his approval and the Lowe's nodded their approval. So they were in agreement. Did the Glucks ever come to you later and say that hedge is too high?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Thusher, no, but the Glucks did come back to us, I believe it was when we did give preliminary approval, and wanted a larger area to be considered for the view, as opposed to just 90 feet long of hedge along their property line. And I believe that is where the discussion's about, well, if it's going to extend across the entire northeast and eastern property line, we don't want to see trees being topped. That's where the discussion with Sam Maphis and the board began about, well, let's include trees that don't grow over 24 feet instead. And maybe this is a way to get around that issue.
So they came back and they decided that not all of that area should be 24 feet in height. Some of that area should be below that.
Or a larger area on the, instead of, if I remember correctly, and I don't have my notes with me, I'm sorry, but when we first saw this early on, it was represented to us as a triangle. And later on, as a project, that triangle began to become more of a rectangle and extend all the way down to Picacho.
Okay, thank you very much.
Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Spann, I asked earlier whether, without the parties' agreement, you would have fashioned the perimeter height limitation, and you said no. Would that be your answer as to the removal of trees as well? You sensed parties' agreement as to that? Because that seems to be a bigger step to me. That's forcing trees out of someone's property is just, it seems another step away from what we typically do. But anyway, let me
go back on the redwood trees. There is great disagreement among experts about the way you treat redwood trees. I'm sure that Claire, who's a respected landscape designer, has her opinion as well. I'd like to hear that as well. But the concern is that if the redwood trees were used as a hedge, which they are throughout Montecito, along the property line, there may be a way to top them and trim them in a way. However, if you look, and if you just saw by this testimony, the way that the redwood trees are planted now, currently, the ones that are in question, are not planted as a hedge. They're planted as a grove or as within an open area. So the concern there is if you top those off, that's not first of all, they're not being used as a hedge. Secondly, if you top them off, they're going to look like trees that have been topped off. And they can never be maintained, or they're not close enough together to create the kind of hedge effect that you might see along an entire property line, 200 or 300 feet long.
And again, your decision to have them removed is the result of what appeared to be the parties' agreement?
Yes.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions to Chairman Span? Perhaps you'd like to stay on, Chairman, when we go into deliberation. But now there's, I think, an opportunity for the appellant to speak.
Thank you, Chairman McGribley and Derek Weston. I think I can keep my comments just quite brief, a minute or two. The discussions of the parties pertaining to their 24 feet, I'm going to talk about that first, Commissioner Tilcher, because you mentioned it a number of times, was based on an effort to reach a compromise when they thought there would be a real binding agreement that would truly carry through and affect the property indefinitely. We feel that the conditions, that it is not adequately clear what that requirement really is, and that it would be difficult to enforce it as it is worded. So if that is the way it is to end up, we think that language needs to be looked at very carefully to make sure that it means what we thought. When the Glucks, in that negotiation process, in an effort to be a good neighbor, talked about accepting 24 feet, it means that they would wipe out their entire ground floor view. So it's an enormous concession. They wanted to make sure that what was left was a plane that they truly would see over. And I don't think the conditions are strict enough or clear enough that there really won't be a lot of landscaping that will grow up. So they are concerned about the substance, but it was a huge, huge concession. I do want to comment briefly on the comments which a number of the applicants repeated about being let into the club and have the opportunity to build an estate house comparable to the neighbors. And what I think is being lost sight of is the fact that they are proposing building that is much larger than any of the neighbors. It is not comparable. Now, to say, as Chris Jacobs does, that they are entitled to have the same kind of amenities that other estate homes have, of course they are entitled to have a cabana and a guest house and all of those things. That is not the issue. The Glucks have a small cabana of 160 square feet. What I am concerned that you are losing sight of is that this house, if you look at it in a gross square footage basis, will be about 15,500 square feet, larger than any of these homes that they supposedly compare themselves to. I think you were on the right track at the beginning of this hearing when you talked about the larger community. And I'm not sure all of you agree with me, but I think it is completely appropriate to look not only at the size guidelines with respect to the principal residence, but then to step back and look at the entire picture to make sure that the guidelines aren't being used in a way where you lose sight of the forest for the trees, to pick an appropriate metaphor in this case. And that's what's happening. The proposed residence already is much bigger. Now, it's true that there are a few residences built after the guidelines that are bigger. That's true. The one that Chairman Span referred to that was much larger was built long before. But none of them have significant outbuildings or extra buildings. So we're not comparing apples and oranges. We are comparing apples and oranges. It's very important to keep track of the fact that this project is bigger than anything, anywhere in the neighborhood. That is the reality. And if you'd be good enough, Aaron, to put up the chart, I would encourage you to look at the chart, which is included on my latest letter. I think if you study those numbers, and I know some of you are really numbers people, it's very clear that it is bigger in every single respect than any other house in the neighborhood. And it is between 150 and 200% of the average in the neighborhood. And that is just using a narrow definition of neighborhood. I'm sorry, that is the applicant's chart and not ours. Because our chart, unlike this one, counts the guest houses, cabanas, all the extra footage, because that's the footage that everybody in the community will see. I think that if this ends up with a process where this is allowed to go through, the community is going to be very surprised that this commission approved a project that in reality is over 15,000 square feet of development, larger than any other single home in the area, and significantly larger than all of its immediate neighbors, on the theory that they're entitled to it under neighborhood compatibility. And that's where I'm concerned that we may be losing sight of the forest for the trees. We have been very patient. In our view, that interpretation is not a changing of a rule, but the enforcement of what always has been the rule, that you have to ultimately look to neighborhood compatibility. And I do want to point out that when Chris Jacobs quoted the section of the Montecito plan that refers to neighborhood compatibility. He misquoted it. He read it wrong. That section states, a project with floor area size substantially in excess of the floor area of immediately surrounding properties. And when he read it, he said larger than the guidelines. But that's not what it says. It looks at floor area. And I think it's an appropriate direction from the Montecito Community Plan that in addition to the guidelines, you need to look at everything that's going on the ground. And I do not see a rational basis for approving a project that is larger than anything else anywhere in the neighborhood. I just don't see how you get there. I thank you for your patience. I know everybody else does as well, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Commissioner Berg?
Chairman McGrovlian, if I could, Mr. Weston, I understand your argument about the total size, and I think there's logic to your arguments that this is, in fact, the biggest house in total square footage. But isn't your client ultimately interested in preserving its view, and that square footage is much less of an issue for them than simply coming up with a methodology where they know that that view is preserved? Isn't that, in fact, what you're hoping to achieve ultimately? And that the arguments related to FAR are really methods of getting the project to be reconsidered so that that issue can be more directly addressed. And I'm just trying to be, isn't that where we're really headed?
Yes and no. There is definitely truth to what you're saying. I mean, I'm always try to be as candid as possible. If they could have more realistic protection of their views, they would feel that they had gained something. So that is definitely true. At the same time, they had no idea that this house was that big because they too focused on the guideline number and assumed it was a house similar in size to the adjacent houses. And until really the last few days when we've been focusing on it, you can ask Fred, no idea that this house was about twice as big as their principal structure. So they do have a concern that it tends to dwarf the other houses in the neighborhood, and they certainly have a community concern. And yet it is also, and those are legitimate concerns. And it is also true that their view is of major concern to them, and if they thought it were more realistically protected, they would feel much better. Now, is that a fair answer to your question?
That is a fair answer, because that's how I would feel if I was the Glucks. Yes. If the basement's filled in, I'm really not going to know. But if the view's protected, I'm going to know from the house. So just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Mr. Phillips.
Mr. Weston, as Commissioner Berg stated, I'm concerned about the creep as well, and I wish maybe there was a better way, but I think you're asking for the Western analysis of determining compatibility and size, and that's a lot to ask of us right now. And it's amazing, it seems to me, that in the process you have view protection, the first time they've ever given it. I feel terribly for the Glucks, and I hope the people that sold them the house and never suggested that view is sacrosanct, and we all know it isn't. But if we go down that road, what a mess we'd be in. The hedge police would be all over the place, and it would be unworkable. And it seems to me, following Commissioner Tilscher's view, that, boy, if that had been down at 15 or 16 feet, you really would have been not here today, I think. But as Mr. Spann said, the only reason that's at 24 is that you guys seem to agree to it. I'm not speaking for everyone, of course, but I guess I'd be pleased that I got some view at all.
Well, thank you. We would much prefer it lower, that agreement came in the context of believing there would be stronger protections in connection with it. And I do want to say, when you refer to the Weston interpretation, I really think that that's not correct. I personally participated in an appeal that went before the Board of Supervisors on a big project in Cowles Road. And the Board of Supervisors definitely concluded that the neighborhood that it mattered in that case was the Cowles Road neighborhood, and that this house was out of proportion to the neighborhood. They did not focus on the FAR question. They focused on exactly this question.
Well, I was more speaking to your wanting to include the basement. I mean, you're up to 15,000 square feet. I don't want to belabor that.
But you know that I gave you the figures both ways, even without the basement. If you look just at the house, it's the biggest. If you look at the house with outlying buildings, it's even bigger. And if you look at with the basement, it's even bigger yet. So I think under any measure it is large. And thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Weston. Yes, Mr. Jacobs.
Chairman McGrebley and members of the Commission, just a few comments. First, to address some of the questions that were raised during the public comments. Mr. Grokenberger and Mr. Gluck both referenced a threatening letter that they claim was sent to Mr. Gluck, and it was in fact sent to Mr. Gluck. It's in your packet. It is within some materials submitted by Chip Woolbrandt, and it's under a letterhead that says NWW Investments LLC. And midway through that packet, you will see a letter from the law firm of Price, Postel, and Parma. Basically, all that letter does is say that if you believed you had permission to come onto the property to trim trees or have your gardeners come onto the property to trim trees, that permission is being withdrawn. It recognizes that there was a misunderstanding. Mr. Waite does not recall apparently giving permission to Mr. Gluck. Mr. Gluck may believe that he did have permission from Mr. Waite. So that addresses that. Another question that came up was that Mr. Filippini says he has concerns about the setting of the story poles. As Chairman Spann indicated, the story poles for both the residents and for the screening vegetation were both set at finished grade. So we actually figured out what finished grade was going to be and set those poles so that people could actually see what was going to be the end result. As to the cupola, it is not visible from Mr. Filippini's house. You're in a really difficult position. You're being asked by the appellant to condition this project in a way that you really can't condition a project. I don't believe that your commission has the authority to impose a condition that requires one private property owner to grant another private property owner a view easement. In essence, that's what you're being asked to do in one way or another, either through an actual easement or through a restriction over the portion of the property which is claimed as being the view corridor, which would restrict the height at a specific height. One way or another, you would be compelling the granting of some kind of a transfer of rights from one private property owner to another, and I don't believe that you can do that, and I don't believe it's appropriate to do it, and I don't think it would be a good thing to head down that road. I think that there's been a lot of discussion about trees and landscape architecture and tree selection. One thing that we heard fairly clearly from the landscape architects, Sam Mafis, who was on the MBAR, and others who commented, was that the concept of maintaining a portion of a property with a flat top haircut in perpetuity is not good landscape design. The trees, in effect, add to the community character, and that trees can frame views, and the views through trees, which are appropriately maintained, are attractive. There's been a discussion about the triangle and height restrictions, and I believe that in the final action of the MBAR, height restrictions were set for the hedge along the entire easterly boundary of the property. They increase in height as you move to the south because obviously the ground falls away. Finally, I just want to point out that the Burkhoff Trust, in acquiring this property, had a reasonable expectation with respect to what they could do with it. I think they had a reasonable expectation that the Montecito guidelines would be followed and that existing practices with respect to interpretation of those guidelines would be followed. I just think it would be a terrible thing to have the rules change midstream. So with those comments, I'll conclude.
Just a moment, Mr. Jacobs. Counsel, I want to raise a question with regard to this hedge height. Is a condition imposed by either the MPC or the MBAR on the height of a hedge a valid one or a viable one?
Those are two different questions, valid and viable.
Viable is the one I had in mind.
Yeah, right. I'll answer valid, and Diane will address viable. I would say I really like Tony's manner, and I think they try really hard. It's probably that condition was a good, no good deed goes unpunished, as Shane often says. It would put the county in a terrible bind to require, when I don't see anything, and I don't think that the MBAR saw anything really that could, that was a nexus for them to do it. I think they did it really in a spirit of compromise, which is great. It's unfortunate that that compromise didn't hold. So I see that the view issues are related to structures in your policies and in the guidelines. And you're sitting today as both the BAR and as a staff person at the counter. So you've got both the policies and the guidelines in front of you to make your decision.
Yeah. So my conclusion then from your comments and from the comments that Mr. Jacobs has made is that if there's any attempt to make a restriction on a hedge, it would be by species selection.
Mr. Chair, this is where I think the viability comes in. And speaking as the person responsible for permit compliance and zoning enforcement, it would not be a very tenable position for the department to be in if we picked plants that required continual maintenance to be kept at a certain height. I don't think that's a realistic expectation. I think we have a hard enough time ensuring that yours and the BAR's conditions are carried out in the field. And if we added this to that mix, I'm afraid that we would fail dismally and everybody would be unhappy. So species selection, I think, is perfectly appropriate. The BAR has a lot to say about that. I think when applicants agree to do things, it's different than placing a condition on them. And I think what Mr. Span essentially said was everybody agreed that this was a reasonable way to go, at least at a particular point in time. If that's the case, they agreed, the species take care of the height, we don't have a problem with that approach.
Yeah, I do understand that agreement between the neighbors would be something which survives so long as they survive, among other things. So it's a temporal effect in itself.
Mr. Chair, actually, in this particular case, if the approvals incorporate certain species of landscaping, that's what the approvals incorporate.
I was talking about limiting the height by cutting, by pruning.
Correct.
Yeah.
But the plans as approved by the BAR, assuming that the Montecito BAR, assuming that the Montecito Planning Commission were to uphold them, are the plans that they would need to.
I don't have any doubt about that because they have jurisdiction over the landscaping issue. Commissioner Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the 24 feet is to be ignored. That is no longer in any document. Just species.
No, that's inaccurate. The 24 feet hedge limitation it says hedge maintained at 24 feet above finished grade.
Well, that's.
So that is part of the approved landscape plan. There's another reference I might add to the trees, which don't even want to go there. But right now the hedge does have, a, maintenance reference on the plans.
Well, the 24 feet seems redundant if the species selection was to stay under that number.
The species selection that are on the plans is easily maintained at 24 feet.
Commissioners, Mr. Jacobs has the podium, and if you have questions or comments to him, let's take care of those. Deliberations we can take on momentarily.
I may be able to help with the answers. It was agreed that there would be height limitations on portions of the hedge. Those limitations are incorporated within the approved landscaping plan. We understand those to be enforceable restrictions. They're all applicable to the perimeter landscaping. The interior portions and the tree selections inside of the perimeter have been made by species selection. The trees that were selected presumably grow to a height that is appropriate in terms of that particular location and the perceived view corridors. The hedging material is primarily myoporum in that particular area, and I think its terminal height may be something more than 24 feet. It's probably in the 30 to 35 foot range, but Commissioner Gottstanker probably knows a lot more about that than I do.
All right. Commissioner Phillips, are you concluded for the moment?
Mr. Jacobs, the height limitation wouldn't have happened except that your client and Mr. Gluck agreed to it. Is there a way to pull this height limitation out of this agreement and for you and the Glucks to fashion something that maybe is 20 feet? As I looked from Gluck's second story, it is so close to right at 20, from what I can tell from the pole, but it's above it a little bit. And I don't know if that solves the problem, but this seems to be, if we have this height limitation in this condition, we're going to be living with this forever, I think, and you'll be arguing this and forever, and it just doesn't seem to belong here. And it wouldn't have been here but for the agreement. I wonder if there's a way to pull it away from here and get it done.
We were trying to do two things when we selected that hedge height. One, we were trying to reach this very delicate balance of screening out the majority of the Gluck's residents, and particularly on the southeasterly corner, there's a covered patio, and some of you that were at the site may have been there. And with the screening at 24 feet, when looking back towards the Gluck's residence from 700 Picacho Lane, you can still see the roof of the Gluck house, but you can't see into the interior areas of that outdoor covered living space. All the same, when looking from the Gluck's house, from that same room, you can see over the hedge at 24 feet, and it doesn't interfere with the ocean view. So we had originally proposed a more stepped approach. When the Glucks saw the string line set at 24 feet, they said, you know, it doesn't really matter if it's 22 or 24 or 20. 24 works.
Well, good.
Commissioner Tilcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to ask council I just want to clarify something that you'd said. When Mr. Jacobs said that, in effect, there would be a transfer of property rights if we cite any specific height. I think that's what you said, and excuse me for 1 second. And if we, and that you felt that the county would be in a very difficult position to defend itself in the event that we impose some height on that hedge. Now, if MBAR approved that height, why is that a problem? Isn't it within their prerogative to approve that height? And why is that an issue for the county? Am I Reading you wrong?
No, not too wrong. I think that the county can impose height limits. You could say, whoa, you've got a finding in your BAR findings that you look at the landscaping and you as the BAR and the BAR, when they were sitting as the BAR looking in this project, they have an obligation to look at the landscape plan and make sure that it's harmonious with the project. And I don't remember all the components of that finding, but certainly they could say a tree, thanks, Peter, adequate landscaping shall be provided in proportion to the project and this site, and et cetera. Adequate provision for maintenance of all planting. So you could say that height of a tree is simply not in proportion, or it's too low, it's too high, it's too wide, whatever. My point, I think, and Mr. Jacobs' point is that if you say your tree has to be 16 feet or 20 feet for your neighbor to look over your house and through your yard, that is closer to being a problem for me.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, to maybe just further address Commissioner Phillips' question about whether or not that height limit ought to be on the BAR plans, I would say it's problematic. And if that it's okay to pick plant material that is intended to reach that height, but to expect the county staff to monitor the height of landscaping, I think is not appropriate. If they wanted to enter in, if the property owners wanted to enter into a private agreement and enforce that private agreement against each other, that would be perfectly acceptable to your staff. But I don't think it's a realistic expectation for us to monitor the height. It should be done through plant material selection.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Director, I agree, and Chairman Span wouldn't have done this but for the perceived agreement of the parties. I mean, we are, it's nearly a taking issue, and I can do this. I can go with this, but we're going to have to strongly underline that the parties wanted this, and that would provide exceptions for us in the future, I think.
Mr. Chair, and I don't want to jump ahead in this hearing process because I don't know where the commission is going, but I would strongly recommend that, given what you've heard today, if you are inclined to uphold your staff and the BAR's approval, that you eliminate this provision, because I don't think we do have agreement.
Well, based on everything,
the plant material will take care of it. I would just eliminate the rest.
I think that's the crux of the matter, that if we're going to attempt to have any influence on that matter, which would be compatible with what the applicant and the appellant is saying, is that we would provide a condition that limits the choice of vegetation, the shrub material. And I think that's certainly within our purview to do that, and the purview of the MBAR to do that. That's a landscaping issue over which we have authority, not a height issue directly. Mr. Weston, do you want to speak?
Well, you're focusing in on the concern that has concerned us the entire time, which is that the enforcement of this condition, which was at least offered by the other side, seems to be very slippery. I understand exactly why the county is concerned. I think it is not desirable, it's not ideal to have that be a condition that the county has to worry about. We would much prefer to have a formal agreement between the property owners that restricted the height to 20 feet or maybe 22 feet or any specific amount so that we did not have to involve the county. Part of our concern now is that, and I should be corrected if I'm mistaken about this, that there is some designation of species in the middle of the property, but the hedge material is not a species that's expected to grow to a certain height. And Claire, you may correct me if that's wrong. I think it's a hedge that was expected to be trimmed to a certain height. You're checking, is that correct?
Yes, the species is a ficus or podocarpus hedge, planted as a screen to be maintained at at 24 feet. Well, that's an easy thing to do.
It would grow taller if it weren't maintained. Is that correct?
Well, portocarpus will grow into a very large tree if not maintained.
So in this instance,
the ficus, the green gem ficus, it'll have a hard time getting up to 24 feet. It'll take a while.
It will be very disappointing to us, to say the least, if the end result of this hearing is to eliminate that condition entirely and to leave the same species on the hedge, because then we really get nothing. And I just don't think it's appropriate.
Mr. Weston,
and I certainly understand, with all respect, Commissioner Phillips, with all respect, I disagree that it's a taking issue. If you have the right to specify a species, you have a right to specify the height. It is an identical issue. However,
I don't know that we have the right to specify species either, but we're taking trees away.
Right.
I don't know. I certainly wish that we weren't hearing this.
I understand that. We wish you weren't hearing it. I can.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay. So my only concluding comment is that I think your ultimate right to approve the project or not, on which I certainly think you have discretion, gives you the opportunity to encourage the applicants to resolve this issue. So we appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Weston.
Just as a clarification and perhaps to help, we would be glad to switch the hedging material to ficus green gem.
Yeah, it's actually on your plan already as one of the possible things.
That's fine.
Yeah.
We want to eliminate the others and go with that hedging material. That's acceptable.
Well, and that is a hedging material that's consistent with the other. I mean, I know that the Nigro property, that is the hedge that's there, and it is a hedge that, it's like what I was just saying is like Chairman Griblian was saying, well, say what species? Well, the reality is any hedge will grow ultimately. There isn't a species that doesn't need to be maintained as a hedge. In order to cause it to be a hedge, it's a tree that you have to continually prune. That's what makes it a hedge. So there's no particular species that isn't going to turn into a tree at a later date if untrimmed. Even all of our portocarpus hedges, the myoporums die before they get that big because they don't have a long life. So to make it species specific, I mean, this is for the commission, I'm saying is somewhat unrealistic, and one of the slower growing, easier to maintain hedges that's come into the landscaping business within the last 10 or 15 years is the green gem ficus. So we never saw those 20 years ago. That's been developed as a hedge material in the business. So if that is what the commission decides is that you want a species, that would be my recommendation, that would be the species that we go with because it would be easier to maintain.
We would accept that modification to the project, and Commissioner Gottstanker is right. The plant material both on the northerly side and the easterly side, the Gluck and the Nigro sides, are both green gem ficus.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Jacob. The commission has already begun its deliberations, evidently. So we will continue. Commissioner Gottstanker.
So, Mr. Chair, as long as we're on the landscaping, because as far as I see, there's two issues here to the appeal, but so we now are into the whole landscaping issue. There is actually a notation on the plan that says, and it is in the upper corner that we're talking about, where we're trying to, get some sort of view across the Burkhoff Trust property that says trees may be maintained at 24 feet. So I think that there's been a mixing of apples and oranges, and I would just like to point out that we have two different issues. We have a hedge, which is easily maintained at 24 feet. I think the resistance, and certainly my resistance, when I was at the MBAR hearing and this issue came out, and I spoke out very verbally at that time, that I do not think in Montecito that we want to set a precedent for trees, you know, being topped off at 24 feet. You know, I mean, there are communities, Pacific's Palisades comes to mind, and I did speak to this at the MBAR hearing, where there is actually, the entire community is topped off at 16 feet. That is not the character of Montecito. So I strongly feel that that particular notation should be taken off the plans. You know, that the trees, you know, and as several people have said, you know, a good landscape architect or garden landscape designer, you know, can literally frame views with trees, you know, and that's something that I don't know how to work out, like right here, right now, with a piece of paper, because it's a three-dimensional thing. But I strongly believe that there should be no condition or no recommendation on the landscape plans that trees of any species should be topped to 24 feet.
Okay, so your suggestion is that in order to avoid that requirement, that the trees that are specified in the corner, that northeast corner, be eliminated?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. No, I'm just saying that the 24-foot height limit be eliminated. I don't think we've gotten around to deciding what species of trees necessarily need to go in that corner.
All right, let's
Is
continue.
that clear? I mean, you looked like you were confused. Was that clear, what, you know?
Well, I was a little uncertain as to what your objective was in your remarks. You were just concerned about the topping.
Yes, yes, and I just wanted to clarify that for me, it's two different issues. A hedge is one thing, trees are another thing.
That part I did understand. Okay. You're thinking about the trees right now, and those trees could be very tall. That's a fact, the way they're specified now. They're redwoods, aren't they?
Excuse me, Mr. Chair?
No, I am not talking about the redwoods. I am talking about the species on the plan, which is evergreen pears and the New Zealand Christmas trees. Those are the ones, and neither of those are particularly fast or tall trees here. Of course, in New Zealand, the New Zealand Christmas trees are huge, but not here. They're not.
Mr. Chair, I just want to interject real quickly. Sam Maphis and the rest of the MBAR agree wholeheartedly with the comments that Claire just made. If you look at the landscape plan, the Glucks had a concern that there were 4 trees located in this approved plan. The statements were made by Mr. Maphis that the evergreen pear and the New Zealand Christmas tree it would be very difficult for them to get up to 24 feet. However, to appease the Glucks at that particular time, Mr. Maphis allowed this one note to occur here because he thought it was a mute issue.
Okay. Well, thank you for that remark. My impression was from a previous remark that those were redwoods there. That's why I was concerned. But your comment is entirely acceptable. Okay. Commissioner Phillips.
Mr. Chair, fellow commissioners, we're heading down a very twisted path. The good neighbor policy looks to siting of the home. MBAR moved that house over to the west. I'm very sympathetic to the Gluck's position, but we should not, and MBAR would not have gotten into species selection, height limitation, if it wasn't thought of as a compromise. This is not what we should be doing.
Can I see the guidelines?
Okay, Commissioner Berg.
I disagree a little bit. I think it's appropriate for us to do landscape by design. In other words, rather than pick a height for maintenance, I think it's totally appropriate for us to say, for instance, we could deny this appeal. I'll just throw it out. We could deny the appeal, but say we'd like this project to go back and for the final landscape plan to be designed such that there is by design a view corridor similar to the one that was being considered. Without dictating material, let the landscape architects work that out. That's their purview and what they should be doing. And while I'm speaking, I guess my other question to my fellow commissioners is, how do you feel about this issue? I mean, at some point we have to address, is this house compatible with this neighborhood or not? And I don't think we've touched on that.
Through the landscaping first.
Well, I think, but the reason I ask the question is because if we're only really addressing maintaining a view corridor, we're really avoiding the issue of, is this house compatible? Because conceivably we could say, it's not compatible. It's close, but we're going to have to send it back for to take some square footage out of it, because not that it's outrageous, because I don't think it is, but we could say, in the context of designing a project that's compatible with the neighborhood, this one is just a little bit further than we feel is appropriate, and it just needs a little more work, and it's appropriate to send it back. I'm not making that as a motion. I'm just suggesting it as our next topic for discussion.
Commissioner Berg, I appreciate your comments, and that's an aspect of this project that we haven't come to yet. I want to put the rest, this matter of our thoughts on the subject of the landscaping. Let's settle that matter first. Commissioner Gottsdenker, you had additional comments?
Yes, I do. Given what Commissioner Phillips has said, that is not really within the purview, and I just wanted to take the opportunity to disagree with my fellow commissioner in that we ask for, in the documentations during the review process, we asked for a preliminary landscape plan showing existing and proposed trees and shrubs, including any existing vegetation to be removed. That then goes on as part of the final landscape, the final review. And then if you go to section H, there are 2 pages of guidelines with regards to landscape planting and landscape designs and the character of the materials and on and on and on. So I disagree. It is within the purview of the MBAR to deal with, and I want to point out that it actually is a community plan policy that the significance of the urban forest be maintained throughout the Montecito community. So it is very definitely within the purview of MBAR to review, and subsequently us to review, landscape issues.
But not to create a view for a neighbor. Not
Absolutely not for. Yeah, no, there is nothing. In fact, if we really look historically, it's been just the opposite. It has been the precedent of the writing of all of these landscape issues to actually create privacy, both from streets and from neighbors. That's what MBAR is looking at. They're looking at how can a property owner privatize their piece of property. Yeah, so this view is this is a whole new ballgame here.
Yeah. Secretary.
Mr. Chair and members of the commission, I think there's 2 points in the section of landscaping that are particularly relevant here, and I think it's the tension that's in the room in terms of landscaping. One is that that privacy between adjoining properties should be maximized. That's under landscaping on page 23, it's C. And the other is that planting should be compatible with the character of the site, the project, and the surrounding area. Now that doesn't say maintain private views, but that it be compatible with that area. So I think that's where the tension lies right now, and the tension between the particular property owners. I do think it's an appropriate thing for your commission to address in the context of the appeal, but I think that's where you need to really focus.
Commissioner Tilcher.
Thank you, Chairman McGrivlin. I agree with Commissioner Barrick. I feel that we should be able to, it seems appropriate to take this project and take it back to MBAR for some consideration landscaping-wise before we ever get to the other subject of size. But it just seems appropriate that it should go back with that in mind as to species, as to what trees are to be removed, and I suppose we're I suppose when it goes back, we're not going to be able to deal with height?
Mr. Chair,
Second.
I have a suggestion. First of all, I think I would request that you ask Mr. Span what he thinks about that, because I did ask him whether or not he thought the BAR addressed the framing of views and the appropriate selection of plant material. And I think, based upon our very brief conversation, he thinks they did. So if you don't think they did, you're going to need to give the BAR some guidance. So that's point number one. Point number two is, don't send this back just to address landscaping and then come back and talk about the building.
I didn't
today.
want it to break it in two pieces, but I'm just referring to the landscaping problem.
But you know, if what you're asking for is for the BAR to do some more work, I think what you see is a unanimous decision of the BAR that this was an appropriate treatment of the site. And so if you don't think it was, give them some guidance.
But Mr. Chair,
Just a moment, Commissioner.
You need to ask that publicly. You whispered that.
No, I wanted Commissioner Gotstanker to indicate from her perspective whether or not the MBAR's address to the matter of the landscaping and the view corridor, et cetera, was an adequate one, as proposed to us.
Yes, I do think it was an adequate one, you know.
Okay.
And the only thing that I don't, you know, as I said previously, is that I do think that the condition of maintaining those trees at 24 feet should be taken off. I understand where they were coming from, and I don't think that they necessarily would have done that on any other project other than it was to sort of create something that, I don't know whether it's appropriate for them to create a view easement like that.
All right, Chairman.
And that's the only problem I have with the landscape plan.
Mr. Chair, the only other comment I want to make in this issue is remember that this project has to come back to MBAR to receive final approval. So if there are any conditions that you want, the PC wants us to look at, we could always do that at that time as well.
We have other issues to address. I just want to put the bed this matter of the landscaping. Commissioner Phillips, do you have any other comments on this subject?
Mr. Chair, we have to decide whether we're creating whether we're fashioning a condition based on a neighbor's view opportunity, or else Mr. Span has no direction. And I think he told us that he wouldn't have done this sua sponte, on your own. You wouldn't have done it.
Absolutely not. We cannot find a nexus.
Okay.
Then,
just a moment.
That's just for the height. I think they were okay with the plant species, weren't you?
Yes. Oh, you
Chairman
were.
Span?
We're okay with the plant species.
I think that's the crux of the
It's just
matter.
the height thing.
All right.
That's the crux of the matter. That was the basis of my comment that the MBAR had adequately addressed this issue by plant selection and configuration. All right, I'm satisfied with this particular subject. Let's go on to another one. Secretary.
Mr. Chair, before you talk about the size of the house and compatibility, I thought maybe you'd just like your staff to read you the same section everybody else has read to you. Because I think, and maybe we need to put it up on the screen, I think it is really an important section, because the way that this provision in the guidelines is structured, there's a general statement of purpose. Nobody's read you that general statement of purpose, I don't think. And that general statement of purpose says, the Montecito community is concerned about the mass of a structure as it appears to the community. Now, I heard somebody ask, would it matter to you if you couldn't see it? And the answer I heard was, well, sort of. That's not what this says, from my reading of it, particularly in relation to surrounding open space and structures in the neighborhood. In order to ensure that development will be compatible with the community, the size of homes will be reviewed in relation to other homes on similar sized lots in the surrounding neighborhood. And then it goes on and goes through the guidelines and the provisions that about floor area ratio and how you review this chart, and that it's a guideline, and that if a project is has a floor area substantially in excess of the floor area of the immediately surrounding properties, that property will have the burden of demonstrating that the project cannot be viewed by surrounding property owners due to its siting, or that its spatial volume, when taken together with its lot size, setbacks, and landscaping, does not make it incompatible. So I agree with Mr. Weston, this isn't just about numbers. It's really about, number one, can you see it? And if you can, is it compatible or not? It's really not just the size. So I just wanted to at least help you frame that by my read of the language.
Ms. Meester, if I could just add to something that you said, there's an addition to the policies of the Montecito architectural guidelines in the land use element, a visual resource policy that addresses scale and character of homes in urban areas relative to the existing community. Staff routinely defers to MBAR on issues of neighborhood compatibility or on floor area issues in Montecito. So staff in its review, as we reviewed the project against the community plan and against the other elements of the comprehensive plan and the ordinance, we looked to the MBAR to make that determination with respect to floor area and with respect to size, bulk, and scale.
Okay. I'm going to propose that we take a 5-minute break and then come back and address the matter of the size and bulk and scale. That comes before us as a